There's something comforting about knowing that no matter how bad customer service feels today, it has always been bad. Not metaphorically, literally. 4,000 years ago, a man sat down and wrote a complaint so detailed, so bitter, and so emotionally restrained in the most passive-aggressive way possible that it survived millennia. Not because it was poetic, not because it was revolutionary, but because it was relatable. This is the oldest known written customer complaint in human history, and it's about copper. History is usually told through wars, emperors, and grand events. But today we're looking at something smaller, something familiar, stories that prove humans have never really changed. This is Same Old Humans. To understand why this complaint exists at all, you need to understand what writing was used for when it first appeared. It wasn't philosophy, it wasn't storytelling, it wasn't poetry, it was accounting. Early writing systems existed to track transactions, obligations, shipments, and debts. Writing was a tool for people who needed proof that something had been promised and that it hadn't been delivered properly. Which already tells you something important. The very act of writing was born out of distrust. The man who wrote this complaint was named Nanni. We don't know what he looked like. We don't know his age. We don't know much about his life. But we know exactly how annoyed he was. Nanni was a merchant in Mesopotamia, living around 1750 BCE. Like many merchants of his time, he relied on long-distance trade. He couldn't inspect every shipment personally. He had to trust intermediaries. And this is where things started going wrong. It's easy to imagine Nanni as some hot-headed customer who immediately reached for the ancient equivalent of a complaint form. That's almost certainly not what happened. Merchants like Nanni were professionals. Trade in Mesopotamia depended on reputation, repeated transactions, and trust built over time. If you were known as someone who complained too quickly, too loudly, or too often, people simply stopped doing business with you. Which means this tablet wasn't written after the first bad delivery, or the second. This was the result of a pattern. Nanni had likely already tolerated excuses, delays, assurances that the next batch would be better, promises that didn't quite materialize the way they were supposed to. Because merchants don't escalate unless they have to. They calculate first, and then they wait. There's a specific kind of frustration that only comes from giving someone multiple chances. The frustration of realizing that your patience has not been interpreted as goodwill, but as weakness. That's the moment when irritation turns into resolve. And resolve, unlike anger, tends to leave records behind. By the time Nanni decided to put his complaint into clay, the emotional work had already been done. He wasn't venting. He wasn't hoping for sympathy. He was setting terms. Writing a complaint like this was not neutral. If Ea Nasir took offense, Nanni could lose access to copper entirely. He could damage his standing in trade networks. He could become difficult. So this wasn't a tantrum. It was a calculated risk, which suggests something important. Nanni believed he was in the right and that others would agree. That belief only exists when someone is confident the facts are on their side. The tablet itself doesn't capture the weeks or months before it was written, but the silence does. The waiting, the hoping things would improve, the gradual realization that nothing was changing. That silence is the real beginning of this story. The tablet is just the moment Nanni decided he was done being quiet. The recipient of the complaint was named Ea Nasir. Ea Nasir sold copper, and according to Nanni, he sold it badly. Not accidentally, not once, consistently. Enough that Nanni felt the need to document it permanently, which is not a normal response unless patience has already been exhausted. This wasn't a luxury dispute. Copper was essential. It was used for tools, weapons, trade goods, and everyday infrastructure. Low-quality copper wasn't just inconvenient. It could ruin production, waste labor, and cause financial loss far beyond the original purchase. In other words, this wasn't about being picky. This was about reliability. If this were just about bad product quality, the story wouldn't have survived. The real problem was behavior. According to the tablet, Ia Nasir delivered poor quality copper, refused to take responsibility, treated Nanni's messenger with disrespect, and then acted as if Nanni should simply accept it, which is where the emotional shift happens. Because bad products can be fixed, disrespect sticks. At some point, Nanni stopped viewing this as a transaction and started viewing it as an insult. That's when the tone changes. The tablet isn't explosive, it's controlled, measured, which makes it worse. This is not a man yelling, this is a man documenting your failure with the expectation that others will read it. There's also something quietly humiliating about this moment, because once you realise the problem isn't going away, you're forced to admit something to yourself first, before you admit it to anyone else. That you trusted the wrong person, that you waited longer than you should have, that what started as optimism has turned into sunk cost. And that's usually the point where people stop trying to fix the situation politely and start making sure it can't happen again. Not loudly, not dramatically, permanently. Writing a complaint on clay wasn't easy. You had to commission a scribe, shape the tablet, inscribe it carefully, and then fire it. This took time, money, and intention. No one did this casually, which tells us something crucial. Nanni wasn't just angry, he wanted a record. One line from the tablet makes the entire thing feel quite familiar. Paraphrased, Nanni tells Ia Nasir that from now on he will inspect the copper personally and reject anything that doesn't meet his standards. This is not negotiation, this is a boundary. He's saying, going forward, I'll be checking every delivery. You can almost hear the pause at the end of the sentence. Up to this point, everything we've talked about has been context. The world, the trade, the psychology. Now we get the actual complaint. Because unlike most ancient grievances, which vanish into rumour or oral tradition, this one was written down, fired into clay, and preserved by accident. And when you read it, the tone is unmistakable. This is not a man asking politely. This is a man who has already decided he's right. The tablet opens with Nanni addressing Ia Nasir directly. No greeting, no pleasantries, straight to the issue. He reminds Ia Nasir that he paid in advance for copper that was supposed to meet a certain standard, and that what he received did not. Not once, repeatedly. And then comes the line that tells you everything about the power dynamic Nanni thinks he has. Paraphrased, Nanni writes something equivalent to,
"Who do you think you are, that you would treat me with such contempt?"
This is not rage. This is wounded authority. He's not angry that the copper is bad. He's angry that Ia Nasir seems to believe he'll accept it anyway. That's the real insult. Then Nanni brings up something that feels small, but isn't. He says that Ia Nasir treated his messenger poorly, dismissed him, sent him away empty-handed, made him walk back through hostile territory without the copper he was promised. That detail matters because messengers weren't disposable. They represented you. Insulting a messenger was insulting the sender. In modern terms, this is the moment you stop arguing about the product and start remembering how customer support spoke to you. Then comes the sentence everyone remembers. Nanni tells Ia Nasir that from now on, he will personally inspect every shipment, and anything that doesn't meet his standards will be rejected. No negotiation, no escalation, just control. This is the ancient equivalent of saying,
"I'll be reviewing every delivery from now on,"
which is never said lightly. What makes this tablet remarkable isn't that it's old, it's that it's structured. Nanni states the problem, explains why it's unacceptable, documents disrespect, and outlines future conditions. This is not venting, this is leverage. Writing a complaint only makes sense if you believe the system will back you. Nanni clearly did, which suggests Ia Nasir had a reputation. and that reputation was not good. In fact, archaeologists later discovered multiple tablets at Aya Nasir's house, many of them complaints from other buyers. Which is incredible, because it means this wasn't a one-off, it was a pattern. This is where the story gets strange. We don't know how Aya Nasir responded. We don't know if he fixed the problem. We don't know if he lost business. What we do know is that his house became a small archive of dissatisfaction. He is remembered not for his success, but for his customer service failures, which is a brutal form of immortality. The tablet survived because it was never recycled. Clay tablets were often reused. This one wasn't. It was kept. Possibly because it was evidence. Possibly because it was unresolved. Possibly because Aya Nasir never bothered to destroy it. Which feels appropriate. At this point, it's worth admitting something. If you remove the clay, the cuneiform, and the 4,000 years of distance, nothing about this story feels ancient. Someone paid in advance. Someone delivered something substandard. Someone acted like the customer should just accept it. And eventually, someone decided to document the problem. That's not archaeology. That's a Tuesday. We tend to think complaints are about products. They rarely are. They're about expectations. Nanni wasn't upset because the copper was imperfect. He was upset because the deal had been clear, the trust had been implied, and the outcome violated both. The copper was just evidence. The real issue was disrespect. And once people feel disrespected, they stop being flexible. What makes Nanni's tablet so effective isn't rage, it's restraint. There's no shouting, no threats, no dramatic language, just a steady, controlled listing of failures and boundaries, which is exactly the tone people use when they're done negotiating. Anyone who's ever received an email that begins with, "as discussed previously," knows this moment. That email is never the first one. Aya Nasir is remembered today for one thing. Not his trade network, not his wealth, not his success. His bad customer service. And what makes that especially brutal is that he likely had no idea this would happen. He probably thought this complaint would be forgotten, or ignored, or recycled. Instead, his house became an archive of dissatisfaction, which means his reputation outlived him, just not in the way anyone hopes for. Most clay tablets were reused. They were erased, reshaped, written over. This one wasn't. That tells us something important. Either it was kept as evidence, or it was too awkward to deal with, or Aya Nasir simply never resolved the situation. All three possibilities are deeply on brand. The reason this complaint feels modern isn't because people haven't changed. It's because systems haven't. Trade creates dependency. Dependency creates expectation. Expectation creates resentment when it's violated. The tools are different. The emotions aren't. Replace copper with a subscription. Replace a messenger with customer support. Replace a clay tablet with a carefully worded email that you rewrite 3 times before sending. Same structure, same restraint, same quiet threat of escalation. The medium changed. The impulse didn't. There's a reason people still document complaints instead of just venting. Records create leverage. They turn emotion into proof. Nanni understood that instinctively, which is impressive and slightly depressing, because it means we've always known how this works. There's something oddly reassuring about this story. 4,000 years ago, someone dealt with the exact same frustration you felt. They handled it calmly. They documented it. They moved on. The world didn't end. Which suggests that while these problems never disappear, they also never define us. They're just part of living among other humans. History isn't a list of great achievements. It's a long record of people trying to deal with each other without losing their minds. Sometimes that record is written in stone, sometimes in clay, sometimes in a passive-aggressive email you send at 11:47 p.m. Same old humans. If this story felt uncomfortably familiar, you're probably not alone. If you enjoy stories that prove people have always been like this, subscribe for more. Same old humans,